The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, and Marguerite Foss stepped out carrying a thermal delivery bag, a clipboard, and absolutely zero idea that her entire life was about to change. The bag held 12 lunch boxes from Oaken Table, the kind of catered corporate order that kept her employed at her cousin's small catering company while she figured out what came next. The clipboard held the signature she needed. The floor she'd just stepped onto held something considerably more complicated. It was supposed to be a routine drop-off. Suite 4200, Vanthorpe Capital. Sign here, have a good afternoon, back in the elevator, done. Except the receptionist desk was empty. The glass doors beyond it were propped open, and from somewhere deep inside the suite, raised voices were doing something that didn't sound like a Tuesday afternoon board meeting. Marguerite was 29 years old, 5'4", and wore a size 18. She had a master's degree in computational linguistics from McGill that she'd never found a proper use for, a student loan that disagreed with that assessment, and a very firm personal policy about minding her own business. She stood in the empty reception area holding 12 lunches and listened to the voices, 3 different languages, maybe 4. She set the bag down on the reception desk and leaned slightly toward the open doors. French, then something Eastern European, not Polish, not Czech, maybe Slovak. Then heavily accented English that had the cadence of someone translating in real time and getting it badly wrong. Then a 4th voice, very quiet, very controlled, speaking what she was almost certain was Flemish. Marguerite picked up her bag again. This was not her business. She needed a signature and she needed to leave. She walked through the open glass doors. The boardroom was a long, glass-walled room with a view of downtown Montreal that would have been spectacular under different circumstances. Right now it held 8 men around a table covered in documents, 3 of whom were standing, 2 of whom looked like they were about 30 seconds from completely losing it, and one of whom, at the far head of the table, was watching the chaos with the particular stillness of someone who had decided not to show how bad things actually were. He was somewhere in his early 40s. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of face that had probably stopped traffic at 25 and had only gotten more difficult to ignore with age. His name, she would learn later, was Theo Vanthorpe. The Theo Vanthorpe, whose name was on the building directory in the lobby, whose father had built Vanthorpe Capital from a single Westmount office into one of the largest private equity firms in Quebec. Right now, that man was watching his multilateral acquisition deal collapse in real time, because his interpreter had called in sick that morning, and the replacement, the young man standing at the whiteboard looking genuinely panicked, apparently spoke French and classroom German and had just confused the Slovak delegation closing terms with their opening offer. One of the standing men slapped his palm on the table. A rapid burst of Slovak followed, with the word nepriatelné landing hard enough that even Marguerite understood the register, if not the exact translation. "He says it's unacceptable," the young interpreter said helplessly. "Can see that it's unacceptable," Theo said, and his voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that meant something. "What I need to know is what specifically is unacceptable and what they're prepared to counter with." The interpreter looked at the Slovak delegation, then back at Theo. "I'm not sure, sir." A woman to Theo's right, his executive assistant Marguerite would figure out later, leaned close to him and said something in a low voice. Theo shook his head once. "We don't have time to get another interpreter here. The Van der Meersch side has a flight at 4. The Flemish contingent, 3 men in near identical grey suits, exchanged a look that said very clearly they had places to be and were reconsidering whether this meeting had been worth the trip. Marguerite should have left. She had been standing in the doorway for approximately 45 seconds longer than she should have. She had 12 lunches going lukewarm in a thermal bag and a signature uncollected, and a van double-parked on Peel Street. "Het spijt me," she said, to the Flemish gentleman. "I'm sorry. Ik heb even gehoord ik wil niet storen, maar als u wil kan ik helpen. Sorry for overhearing, I don't want to intrude, but if you'd like I can help." All 8 men looked at her. The Van der Meersch side looked at her the way people generally looked at a plus-sized woman in a catering polo who had just appeared uninvited in their high-stakes business meeting, and addressed them in fluent Flemish, which was to say, They looked confused, and then they looked at each other, and then the eldest of the three, a compact, white-haired man who radiated the particular authority of someone who had been told he was right about most things for several decades, said carefully, in Flemish, "You speak Dutch?" "Flemish." "Specifically," Marguerite said, staying in Flemish, "and I apologize for interrupting. I was making a delivery." She held up the bag slightly as evidence. "I can go." "What did she say?" Theo asked. "She said she can help," his assistant said slowly, watching Marguerite with an expression that had moved past surprise into something more calculating. Theo Vanthorpe looked at Marguerite Foss. She looked back at him. The bag was getting heavy. "Can you speak French as well?" he asked. "In French?" "Yes," she answered in French, "and I overheard some of the discussion from the doorway. If you want, I can tell you what the gentleman with the grey tie actually said, rather than what was translated." There was a pause. "What did he actually say?" Marguerite shifted the bag to her other hand. "He said the percentage structure you proposed inverts the risk ratio in a way that benefits your portfolio at their direct expense. He didn't say it was unacceptable. He said it was. His exact word implied something closer to insulting, given what they've put on the table." She paused. "He also said something under his breath that I won't translate directly, but the general sentiment was that they flew here from Antwerp and expected better." The white-haired Flemish man stared at her. Then, very slowly, the corner of his mouth moved. "Ze heeft gelijk," he said. "She's right." Theo looked at Marguerite for a moment that stretched out slightly past comfortable. "Put the bag down," he said. "Please." She almost didn't stay, even after she set the bag on the side credenza, even after Theo asked his assistant to get her a chair and a glass of water, even after the interpreter sat down, quietly relieved. And Marguerite found herself at the end of the long boardroom table with the Slovak delegation on her left, and the Vandermeersch side on her right, and Theo Vanthorpe watching her from the head of the table with an expression she couldn't quite read. The Slovak delegation's lead negotiator, a broad-shouldered man named Miloš, who wore his skepticism openly, looked her over once and then addressed her in Slovak with the deliberate patience of someone expecting not to be understood. She answered him in Slovak. The pause that followed was different from the ones before it. Sharper, Miloš looked at his colleagues. One of them said something very quietly that made the other one almost smile. "What did he say?" Theo asked. "He said I'm either a spy or a miracle," Marguerite said, "and he's not sure which, but either way they're willing to continue." Something shifted in the room. Not dramatic, not the kind of shift that announces itself. The kind that happens quietly, when the temperature drops 1/2 degree and nobody mentions it, but everyone adjusts. They worked for 2 hours. Marguerite translated Slovak to French, French to Flemish, Flemish back to English for Theo's team, and occasionally flagged when the young interpreter beside her rendered something in a way that changed the meaning. She was precise without being pedantic. She paused when the Vandermeersch lawyer shifted into a very specific West Flemish legal register that she hadn't heard in about 3 years and asked him to repeat it, which he did without condescension, and then she translated it accurately and noted for Theo's team which clause the man was specifically protecting. At one point Miloš said something in Slovak that made her pause for just a beat. "He's making a joke," she said when Theo looked at her, "about Canadian winters. It's contextually, he's actually trying to ease some tension. I'd suggest laughing." Theo looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression that said, "I'm serious. It'll help." Theo laughed. Not performatively. A short, genuine sound that was apparently not something this room heard often, because 2 of his own team members blinked. Miloš grinned. The temperature in the room went up about 2 degrees. The Vandermeersch contingent caught their 4 o'clock flight. Before he left, the white-haired man, his name was Henrik, she'd gathered, shook Marguerite's hand and said in Flemish that she was the most useful person at the table, which she translated for no one. Miloš, on his way out, pressed a business card into her palm and said in Slovak that if she ever wanted work in Bratislava, she should call his daughter-in-law, who ran a translation firm and was always looking for people who actually knew what they were doing. She stood in the boardroom after the delegations had gone, watching the catering bag on the credenza and realizing she'd never gotten a signature. "You have a linguistics degree." It wasn't a question. Theo was still at the head of the table, jacket off now, looking at her with the same unreadable expression he'd been wearing for most of the last 2 hours. "Computational linguistics," she said. "McGill. Masters. How many languages? Depends how you count." She picked up the bag. "Conversational or professional?" "Professional. French, Flemish, Slovak, English." A pause. "And reading comprehension in 2 others, but I wouldn't claim professional fluency. You just negotiated a $40 million acquisition in 3 of those. I translated. Your team negotiated." He looked at her steadily. "That's a very specific distinction. It's an accurate one." His assistant reappeared at the doorway. Marguerite had heard someone call her Danielle and said quietly that the legal team was ready when he was. Theo didn't look away from Marguerite. "I still need a signature," Marguerite said, "for the delivery. And I should probably get your confirmation that the food is actually for this floor, because I realized I never verified that." Danielle pressed her lips together in the way of someone who found something funny, but wasn't going to say so. "Suite 4200, Theo said. "Vanthorpe Capital. That's us. Great." She held out the clipboard. "Sign at the bottom." He signed at the bottom. When he handed it back, his eyes met hers, and there was something in them that she filed away and did not examine too closely on her way back to the elevator. She'd just gotten back in the van when her phone rang. An unknown Montreal number. She almost let it go to voicemail. She was already running 40 minutes behind schedule. She still had 2 more deliveries, and she had a distinct feeling about what this call might be, and an equally distinct feeling that she shouldn't answer it. She answered it. "Miss Foss." Theo's voice. Measured, like everything else about him. "I got your number from the delivery confirmation form. I realize that's slightly irregular." "It is," she agreed. "I'd like to offer you a contract position. Short-term, potentially longer if the arrangement works for both parties. We have 3 more multilateral meetings in the next 6 weeks, and our usual interpretation firm is unavailable, unerfahren. There's been a conflict of interest." He paused briefly. "Nothing I can elaborate on." Marguerite pulled out of the parking garage onto Peel Street and sat at a red light watching the rain start on the windshield. "Mr. Vanthorpe, I work for my cousin's catering company. I'm aware. I wasn't available today by design. I happened to overhear a meeting that was falling apart, and I stepped in because—" She stopped. Because she couldn't help it. Because 4 languages going badly wrong in the same room was like watching someone try to play a piano by hitting it with a chair. Because it seemed like it needed to be done. "Yes," he said. "That's why I'm calling." The light changed. She drove. "What are the dates?" she asked. The next 6 weeks were not what Marguerite had planned for the autumn. She gave her cousin 3 weeks' notice. Pauline took it well, mostly because she'd been telling Marguerite for 2 years that she was wasting herself. And by the first week of October, she was sitting in a glass-walled office on the 42nd floor of the Vanthorpe building with a temporary staff badge, a very good chair, and a stack of acquisition documents in 4 languages. Danielle brought her coffee on the first morning without being asked and said, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been organizing other people's professional lives for a decade, "He doesn't take the elevator before 9. He prefers the stairs. He will absolutely not tell you. If he needs something, you have to notice. If he asks your opinion, give your actual opinion, because he already knows if you're hedging." Marguerite looked up from the documents. "Is this standard onboarding?" Danielle smiled with her eyes only. "No, this is specific to you." The weeks had a shape she hadn't expected. Mornings were documents. Contracts, letters of intent, regulatory filings, all needing precise translation with legal sensitivity that she found she was better at than she'd assumed. Afternoons were often meetings, and she sat beside Theo at the long boardroom table and did her job, which was rendering what was said into what was meant, accurately and without editorializing. He was good at what he did. She noticed this without wanting to particularly. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered details from 3 meetings ago. He asked the right question at the right moment, and when someone gave him an evasive answer, he noted it without visibly reacting and came back to it from a different angle 20 minutes later. He also had, she noticed, a way of watching her when she was working that was not exactly professional and not exactly not professional. The kind of watching that was attentive in excess of what the job required. She noted it. She did not address it. On a Wednesday in mid-October, they were the last two in the office. She was finishing a translation of a Walloon environmental compliance document. Dense, bureaucratic, and written as though clarity were a personal offense. And he was reviewing something at his desk across the room, with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, which she was categorically not thinking about. He looked up. "You studied in Antwerp, not a question again, he did that." 6 months, she said, without looking up from the document. "Exchange program. 3rd year of my undergrad, that's where the West Flemish Register came from." She glanced up. "You remembered that? You flagged it as something you hadn't used in 3 years. That was October 2nd. It's October 16th. You've now had 2 more meetings with Van der Meersch's legal team." He paused. "I was curious whether it was coming back." "It is," she said, slowly. He looked at her for a moment. "You should have been doing this all along." The matter-of-factness of it caught her off guard more than sentiment would have. "I didn't know how to make it into a job. You were making it into catering." "I was surviving," she said, and it came out more plainly than she'd intended. Not defensively, just true. He didn't flinch from it. "I know," he said, and went back to his documents. She sat with that for a moment and then went back to hers. The crisis came on a Thursday in November. It wasn't supposed to be a high-stakes meeting. A preliminary discussion with a potential partner firm from Lausanne. Introductory, exploratory, the kind of meeting where you take a temperature and decide whether to proceed. Marguerite had reviewed the documents the previous evening. Straightforward. She got to the building at 8:15, and Danielle intercepted her at the elevator. "There's been a development." The development was this. The Lausanne firm's principal, a man named Bernard Coutaz, who had built his business over 40 years with a reputation for being exceptionally difficult, had arrived early with an additional party that had not been disclosed. The additional party was a lawyer from Zurich, and the language she had brought with her was Romansh. Marguerite stood in the reception area and looked at Danielle. "It's not on the language list," Danielle said. "No," Marguerite agreed. "Mr. Van Horp would like to know if I don't speak Romansh." Danielle looked at her steadily. "He thought you might say that. He also thought you might be willing to sit in anyway." Marguerite looked through the glass at the boardroom, where Coutaz was sitting with the watchful composure of a man who had arrived early specifically to be inconvenient, and the Zurich lawyer was arranging her documents with the precision of someone who intended to use them. "The Romansh speaker," Marguerite said slowly. "Is she translating for Coutaz, or is she there for something specific in the documents?" Danielle tilted her head. "I'm not sure. Does it matter? If she's there as a translator, she'll render everything into standard German or French anyway, and I can work from there. If she's there to contest a specific clause, she'll reference the Romansh text as the binding version." Marguerite paused. "Is there a Romansh version of the preliminary terms?" Danielle picked up her tablet, checked something. "Looked up. There is, apparently. We didn't produce it, they did. It arrived by email at 6:15 this morning." Marguerite was quiet for a moment. "Get me the document," she said, "right now, and tell him I need 12 minutes." She sat in the small kitchen off the reception area with her coffee going cold and the Romansh document on her phone screen, and she did something she had learned to do in grad school during the year she'd spent studying a dialect continuum for her thesis. She read slowly, looked for the Latin roots, matched cognates against her Italian and her French, and noted where the clause structure diverged from the French version they'd been working from. It diverged in 3 places. One was minor, one was ambiguous. One would have transferred liability in a way that had nothing to do with the rest of the document. She walked into the boardroom at 8:32. Theo looked at her from the far end of the table. She gave him a slight nod. "I have something," and took her seat. The meeting proceeded. Coutaz spoke in French, pleasant and expansive, the way men who are planning something tend to be when they want you looking at their face and not their hands. Marguerite translated as needed and said nothing else. When the Zurich lawyer, her name was Renate, Marguerite gathered, introduced the Romansh document as the version they'd be working from for the liability section, Marguerite said, "Of course, Article 14, Paragraph 3. Renate paused, looked at her. The drafting in the Romansh version diverges from the French at that paragraph. Marguerite continued pleasantly. Specifically, the phrase, she said it in Romansh, which she was fairly certain she was pronouncing with a French accent. But the words were right, creates an ambiguity that the French version resolves in the opposite direction. Want to make sure we're aligned on which rendering represents the intended terms. There was a silence. Coutaz looked at Renate. Renate looked at Marguerite with an expression that had moved from surprise into a kind of careful reassessment. You speak Romansh? Renate asked in French. I read legal Romansh, Marguerite said. This morning I had about 12 minutes. She said it evenly, without apology or pride. Just what had happened. I'm happy to proceed in whichever language you prefer, but I think we should resolve the Article 14 question before we continue. Coutaz was very still for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and said something in French that was so quiet Marguerite almost didn't catch it. She caught it, he said. She's remarkable. Not to her, to Renate in an undertone, as if she weren't there, the slight that was so old it had become invisible, speaking about a woman who was sitting in the room as though she were furniture. Theo caught it too. She could see from the way his jaw changed. Mrs. Foss, he said, and his voice had a particular quality she hadn't heard before. Would you translate that for the room? She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, she said calmly, that he finds me remarkable. A pause. I think we can take that as a sign we're ready to proceed. Shall we address Article 14? Coutaz smiled. It had more respect in it than the previous one. They addressed Article 14. The clause was revised to match the French rendering. The meeting concluded productively. Renate shook Marguerite's hand on the way out and gave her a card with something written on the back. The name of a translation collective in Zurich that apparently did not often have openings, but made exceptions for people worth making exceptions for. Theo walked them to the elevator and came back. Marguerite was packing up her notes at the boardroom table when she heard him stop in the doorway. You didn't speak Romansh when I hired you, he said. I still don't really. You just used it to close a liability clause. I read it. For 12 minutes, she searched for how to explain it. When you've learned enough languages the way I have, you develop a kind of structural intuition. You can feel where a text is going before you fully understand it. Like recognizing the shape of an argument before you can name it. He was quiet for a moment. What does that feel like? It was not the question she expected. She thought about it. Like hearing a song you don't know, but can already tell where the chorus is. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not professional and not impersonal, and not whatever they had been carefully maintaining for the past 6 weeks. Marguerite, he said. Just her name. That was all. But the way he said it, with the French pronunciation, the soft second syllable, the slight weight on it, was the way you say someone's name when you've been practicing how not to say it for longer than you'd like to admit. She zipped up her bag. I should finish the Walloon compliance review. Yes, he said. Neither of them moved. And you have the Mirabelle call at 2. I know. So, he said. She walked past him toward the door, and as she passed he said, I looked up your thesis, the dialect continuum study. She stopped. Why? Because you described it once as the thing you were proudest of, and then said it hadn't been useful. He paused. It was remarkable work. Your supervisor's notes are online. She called your analysis, I'm quoting, precise and genuinely illuminating in ways the field hadn't expected. Marguerite stood in the doorway of the boardroom with her bag on her shoulder and downtown Montreal grey and bright outside the glass behind her. You looked up my thesis, she said. Was curious, he said simply. No performance in it, just. I was curious about you, and so I looked. She turned around to face him. He was standing at the boardroom table, jacket in hand, watching her with the same steadiness he brought to everything, the quality that she had catalogued carefully and tried not to find as compelling as she did. The contract ends in 2 weeks, she said. Were you planning to say something about that? I was planning, he said carefully, to say several things about that. I wasn't sure of the appropriate moment. This seems like a moment. He set the jacket down. I'd like to extend the contract, formally, with a title that reflects what you're actually doing, and a rate that. He stopped. That's not. He stopped again, which was interesting because she had not once seen him stop mid-sentence. "That's not what you were planning to say," she finished. "No." The city spread out behind the glass, indifferent and enormous. "I'd like to extend the contract," he said again, more quietly. "And I'd like to have dinner with you. Those are two separate requests and you can answer them separately." Marguerite looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the catering bag on the credenza on the first day, the clipboard, the signature. The 12 minutes with a Romansh document she'd never seen before, the way he'd said her name. "Yes to dinner," she said. "The contract I'd like to renegotiate." Something happened to his face that she thought might be the closest he came to unguarded. "Renegotiate. The scope has expanded considerably since October 2nd, she said. "I think that warrants a conversation." He looked at her, and this time there was no reading required. "It does," he said. "I'll have Danielle block some time for the contract conversation, and dinner is separate, entirely separate," he said. She shifted her bag on her shoulder. Danielle was going to know exactly what had just happened the moment she walked through that door, because Danielle knew everything, and Marguerite found she didn't particularly mind. "Monday," she said, "for the contract. The dinner can wait until we've sorted the professional side first." He nodded, once, like someone who respects a well-drawn boundary and means to honor it. Monday. She walked out of the boardroom and down the corridor to her office, which still had the word temporary on the badge outside the door, and she sat down at her desk and looked at the Walloon compliance document on her screen. And she felt, for the first time in longer than she wanted to count, exactly in the right place, doing exactly the right thing, seen for exactly what she was. She opened the document. She got to work.